Thank you, Arctic Acoustic. I love the music. Hey everybody, welcome back to Hanging with History. This is Season 1. That miracle that happened. That one time. And this is Episode 25, Too Many Threads. The English Reformation, Henry VIII, Part 2. Hey, we've got Raoul Sunset coming back. He's got some interesting insights on this topic, and nobody's eating him. I didn't mention last week that Cromwell was a member of the House of Commons. Howard, Duke of Norfolk, actually set him up in his first seat. Managing Parliament was also a thing Cromwell mastered, a way he could get things done.
Howard got Cromwell his first seat in Parliament, but then they became bitter rivals for power. So that kind of came back to bite Howard in the butt there.
Parliament was in a pretty supine phase during Henry's reign. Individual members could be threatened with death and attainder. Treason was such a flexible concept. Henry got away with things that kings before and after didn't get away with. His strength, physical perfection, personal charisma. People loved him. People feared him. Parliament pretty much did what he wanted. Pretty much. Cromwell pushed through a number of changes that made Henry head of the Church of England, that severed the Church's connections with Rome. He gathered the bishops in council, and though they resisted for a while, the bishops in council agreed with all of it. Not all of it. There were a lot of details. How would churchmen be educated? How would Mass be celebrated? Churches decorated? Celibacy? Would there be monks and nuns? Holy orders? There's a lot of details. The church owned 20 to 25% of the valuable land. It had a huge number of clergy. Employees, we might think of them, though that concept didn't really apply at the time. McCullough makes the point that the church was an idea in some people's heads as more of a trade union for people called clergy. We're not just talking ministers here. We're talking people who run 25% of the economy. So dealing with the church would not be as simple as merely saying Henry was an emperor. Let Henry have the power to end his marriage with Catherine and Mary Ann, and then what?
So, suddenly Henry and Cromwell are in charge of 20 to 25% of the country directly. That's quite a challenge. Usually a recipe for failure.
Oh, yeah. Remember, we ranked Henry's problems as 1. Power, 2. Money, 3. Royal succession, 4. Love for Anne. We kind of solved problem 4. Presumably that would take care of problem 3. Though Anne first delivered Elizabeth, a happy occasion, but also a disappointment at the time. Arguably, Elizabeth Tudor, England's greatest monarch in some dimensions, was a severe disappointment when she was born. Henry wanted a son. He certainly got more power. But more power for what exactly? A lot of what you can do with power requires money also, and the money problem was not solved. Or was it? Was this really Cromwell's plan all the time? Dissolve monasteries, sell their assets, and give the money to the crown? But this was England. Everything needs to be done legally, or it isn't permanent. Already, England is a unique country this way. Did Cromwell say, "Look, Henry, give me 10 years or so, and we'll dissolve the monasteries, raise huge amounts of cash, take away all that extra land the church doesn't need, divert the fees that used to go to the Pope into our own pockets, like most of a bishop's first-year income, for example, and that'll go to the crown. We'll get you out of debt. You can do what you really want. Go invade France again. You'll need to start small monasteries as we consolidate power of the church, get more loyal men appointed bishops and abbots. Those small monasteries will generate good profits, and then later we go for the really big monasteries with huge tracts of land, and finally pay off all your credit card bills."
Could it be that Cromwell laid out this plan, raw and grasping like that, to solve all of Henry's problems in one fell swoop, and planning to do it through Parliament to make it permanent, beyond the power of a future king to change? You have to really believe there is audacity and genius at work there.
A lot of light Tudor history seems like this. Love life solved. And we all know that love and money are enough of a motive for absolutely anything in the world, don't we? But it seems like none, and I mean none, of the great Tudor historians of history or religious historians believe this. They believe, from internal evidence, that Henry was actually a conscientious king, the kind of man who would not turn the world upside down, certainly not mess with God and the church to get what he wants. He didn't just take Anne, for example. If he really believed he owed his place in the world to a grant from God, then by simple logic, God could take it away again. He had to please God. Most of us don't go around thinking, I have to please God. How can I please God today? And also, did you notice at the beginning of this episode that Parliament made Henry head of the church? And didn't we go over the fact that a group that grants power has an implied power to take it away in logic?
You get a lot of mileage out of that little bit of logic, that those who grant power have the ability to take it away later. Could you be leaning on that one insight too heavily?
Is there a flaw in that logic? I mean, we're not speculating about the outcomes, at least. Hasn't ultimate control of the church been conceded to Parliament? Did anyone notice this? Did Cromwell intend this? And why should he, if it were not to give his reforms some permanence? No one seems to think he did it for the purpose of making Parliament more powerful, but that was the outcome. There are many threads here that need weaving together. When Cromwell started dissolving the monasteries, he did it in a specific way. The deal was that he would investigate some of these little rotten, corrupt monasteries that were just like little tax shelters for lazy, sensual men and dissolve those. The good and the virtuous monasteries would be left alone to function as they always did. Henry's self-conception seemed to be a good and godly and lawful good king. He was not a scumbag in his own head. That's one thread.
Really, that one is hard to remember.
This first phase of action against immoral monasteries boosted Henry's revenue by about 40% or so. That's a second thread. I'm minded to see it as a thick, ropey kind of thread. People hated this. There was open rebellion. That's a third thread. Henry and Cromwell couldn't do this alone. There was no real bureaucracy to carry out this massive social and financial change. That had to be created from scratch. So that's a fourth thread. Rebellions needed to be put down with violence and cleverness. Cromwell found he couldn't do this. When it came to large-scale violence, there was a field in which Cromwell could not get things done. Henry had to rely on the traditional military power of the state, the conservative landed nobility. Henry needed them on his side to stay on the throne. That's a fifth thread.
That's a good point. You can't just conjure up a military infrastructure from nothing. When fighting is going on, you have to keep the military forces on your side.
Henry was super focused on foreign affairs, foreign reactions. We're not quite to the level of sophistication that we want to speak of foreign policy just yet, but an idea adjacent to it is valid for Tudor times. Fear of invasion, fear of France and the Empire unifying against him, his chance to invade France, all that stuff going on in Germany, lots of things that people in England could not understand about Henry's actions, make perfect sense when considering the foreign dimension. When you read about Tudor history and it seems like Henry is contradicting himself, consider what Henry might be doing under the eyes of the King of France or the Emperor, and it will often make sense. It does not have to mean Henry's vacillating on questions of religious reform. That's a sixth thread. Whatever the underlying reality, the religious reformers, the Lutherans, the religious radicals, anti-papists, felt themselves to be Henry's allies. The papal supremacists, the pro-Spanish faction, they felt like they were maybe, if they were honest, Henry's enemies. That's a seventh thread. Cromwell was a convinced religious reformer. All this Catholic frippery has got to go. Cromwell was the kind of guy that converted people to the cause of religious reform. He was powerfully in the corner of religious reform. He was subtle about it publicly, but privately, he was a true believer. That's an eighth thread. Cromwell had most of the levers of state power in his hands, and he was a commoner. Whether he actually despised the nobility or not, probably not, because he married his children into noble families when he could. The nobles of the time felt that he did. They said so. They wrote so. They hated him. He had to go. That's a ninth thread.
And there was a crapload going on in Germany and the Netherlands at the time.
Yep, there is Munster. They are drowning Anabaptists in Zurich. Oh, wait, we like that one. We can't be like these people. The peasants are revolting. We can't have that. Everyone's getting burned and beheaded, and refugees are everywhere. This leads to a couple ideas. First, we don't want that here. Second, we are not like them. And it was true. There were days in France and Germany when murders and executions in the pursuit of religious persecution equaled the entire 150-year history of religious persecution in England, narrowly defined.
Are you saying the French and the Germans killed more people in a day? What days would these be? Did they just do it on weekends and holidays, or did they mix it up?
I made a list, and it's depressingly long. If I stop around the truces in 1551 that led to the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, there are many in France in 1545 and 1546 and 1547 as Francois I gets tired of all the infighting. Several times in Central Europe in 1525 and 1526, Westphalia in the 1530s with the killing of the Anabaptists, burn the men, drown the women. Days in 1550 in central Germany, Bohemia a few days in 1549. The Counter-Reformation is just around the corner, and it gets worse then. And we still have the 30 Years' War ahead of us. It only gets worse. Even classifying religiously motivated killing in the broadest possible way, religiously motivated killing was an order of magnitude, or 2, lower in England than on the continent. An order of magnitude is 10. So depending on how you juggle the numbers, continental Europe was 10 to 100 times more murdery than England. I want to wave a flag. I want to blow an air horn. Get your attention to this fact. England is less murdery, like 100 times less murdery than on the continent. Tudor history focuses a lot on murder of religious zealots, but it is nothing compared to the continent. Just a fart in the wind, as my favorite Scotsman used to put it, compared to Germany and France. In episodes 18 to 20, we saw how England solved agriculture in a way no other big countries could. They also solved religion as minimally murdery as could be done, really, given how seriously people took these issues.
Speaking of how seriously people took these issues, are you going to describe what the hot religious issues actually were?
Yeah, maybe. Some, yes. Depends on the feedback I get. It's a tangent, I think, probably. The big issues are the influence of the dead, and the one where you have to think for yourself. This leads to religious radicalism and a lot of killing. But it gets us Hume and Locke and Smith, Pilgrims, Quakers, Methodists, radical tolerance, America. It gets all the good things after paying a great price. I'm interested in how the psychology of predestination does not lead to apathy in the West the way it does sometimes in Islam. The high-energy Dutch and English religious radicals, even after it stops being radical. Why do we see that? The way accumulation of profits becomes possible, and the way profits are reinvested instead of lavishly consumed as they would be in every other context, right? Every other country, every other time. So some, but all that First Commandment stuff, the Eucharist, the unwritten verities, Trinitarianism versus Unitarianism, they make me sad. I have no energy for many of these issues.
Okay, just wondering. I remember an old French observation about wars being fought over whether hymns were sung in Latin or French. I did like the phrase minimally murdery, though.
The relative lack of murderous drives to eliminate all religious opposition is something to keep in mind when we get into the religious issues in England. There was Bloody Mary, the much-loved daughter of Henry and Catherine. She was the worst of them. There was also her little brother Edward, who refused to kill anyone on matters of conscience. And Mary, as bad as she was, killed fewer people during her reign than Habsburg and Valois kings killed some afternoons. Sounds like hyperbole, but it's true, simply true. This can't be because the English were just cooler about religion. The laws to a first approximation were about as strict as everywhere else. They were just generally cooler and less murdery already. And why would this be? We heard in the Magna Carta episode that a sense of, I got rights, man, developed very early in England, which goes hand in hand with an equal sense that everyone else has rights, and a legal system developed that restrained this natural impulse of the powerful who'd see themselves as naturally superior to exploit their inferiors. But above all, that impulse of the powerful to exploit the weak had to be attenuated already. The legal system was getting better and better, fairer and fairer, but slowly. What could possibly have held back the worst human impulses of the English? I've thought about this a long time, and it's surprising how few English historians are willing to deeply engage with this subject. But it has to be the nature of economic relations. Now I sound like a Marxist with the phrase economic relations. The phrase economic relations is empty in a way. To add meaning, you have to think about the way people relate to each other at work. No serfdom, no forced labor, no forcing people to labor for you. Instead, everyone works for wages. If you don't like an employer, you can leave and look for another one. Not that this is easy. Same for an employee. You simply fire him instead of raising a whip to him. That might make for different relationships between people, you think? And this is a persistent human phenomenon. I can recall Gorbachev, remember him, leader of the Soviet Union, reminiscing about his father's job as a Communist Party member on a communal farm? It was to go out and physically beat peasants to make them work. Serfdom is just like that. Europe was just like that. England was not like that anymore. All associations between people were voluntary. So let that sink in a minute.
But cooperation is necessary, as game theory tells us defection against others is smart. For example, beating someone to make them do what you want, if there can be no punishment for the wielder of the whip. And here we can do a whole long digression on kinky sex.
When cooperation is voluntary, punishment is that others stop cooperating with you, and you lose status. Quokka might say, along with Adam Smith, that you are no longer lovely. Coordination is necessary. In our past, as under socialism, that was feudal lords, kings, and socialist party members telling us what to do. Now, coordination via the price mechanism in market solves that problem. Cooperation and coordination, two abstract-sounding ideas, but as practical as life and death. Really, it's where your dinner comes from. The answer for all of human history has been, well, use force. Threat of force, more practically than use of it. But everything always was based on force. And then somehow, some small group on a small island nation, no one could physically force another person to work for them anymore. No one could be limited to one occupation or workplace only. It wasn't exactly the first time this had happened. It wasn't perfect. There were still kings. Kings meant war.
And conscription, and, in England, impressment in the Royal Navy.
Yeah, Britain was living in a bad neighborhood. There were other countries. That meant invasions and fleets and impressing men to fight on the fleets. These were exceptions, important ones, but not the general state of life, a good enough solution to the problem of evil. And back to the Reformation. We have a king, with the kind of problems and desires a king has. We have a king, but a king with other priorities than making sure everyone practices their faith the same way he does. That's badly stated. We have a king, and the king cannot enforce conformity, except he does seem to try somewhat, in some limited ways. But remember all the threads I was talking about? They acted as limits, constraints. The constraints operated in between Henry's ears as much as on the pews or behind the pulpit. I have to ask, could it be that Henry just didn't care as much about religion, and no sufficiently powerful group within Tudor England cared enough to kill everyone? I mean, the Puritans later did care enough. They were willing to kill on a large scale in Ireland. Papists were an existential threat. But remove the existential threat, and their religious ideology was moored by love and individual conscience. There was no flexibility for murderous ideas. Many modern ideologies are near matches for the Puritans, matches in unsuperficial ways. And when they act unrestrained by love and conscience, they prove the most murderous of all. There is a present-day version roaming the rolling landscape of society, but they haven't had a chance at power yet. So we can't tell how well they've solved evil. We just know they believe they are not evil by the sacredness of their cause, because that's always true, pace sterner. Let's go back to the first thread. The dissolution of monasteries and the money it raised, the second thread. And the revulsion it generated in the gentry, the third thread. There were over 600 monasteries in England and Wales. Most started in the 11th and 12th centuries during an idealistic phase at the time. They were the richest landowners, owning far more land than the king. Sometimes, today in histories or fiction, you can detect a note of sympathy for the monks in their monasteries. They were there to educate, tend to the sick, feed the poor, and pray for souls trapped in purgatory. And then the greedy, rapacious Henry VIII and his evil minion Cromwell turned their lives upside down, kicked them out, and where does that leave everyone? But already by the 1520s, there was a lot of scoffing about the ability of monks to pray people out of purgatory, and the number of bequests to monasteries for this purpose dropped like a rock. People's attitudes were changing. There were other methods of education and a competing method of caring for the poor. See episode 17. The monastery's place in society was not what it was, and yet they were very rich and tended to be very beautiful. In the countryside, they were usually the most beautiful place available to ordinary people. Beauty is inspirational. Beauty inspires love. At the same time, the tendency of all institutions to calcify, to fail at their mission, to look out for the interests of the insiders above the people they're supposed to help. A lot of the criticism of the monasteries then sound like Eric Weinstein's criticisms of higher education today. They've forgotten their higher purpose of educating minds. They've forgotten their higher purpose of uplifting souls. Tie this in with envy for rich institutions. Tie this in with Protestant, anti-papal, anti-superstitious ideology, and the monasteries were very vulnerable. Cromwell sent investigators to all of them over an 8-year period. Reports were written, documents created detailing laziness, moral lapses, outright sinfulness, the love that dare not say its name sometimes, financial corruption on a large scale, really a lot of it, it surprises me, and failure to achieve their missions. It was easy for Henry to approve the dissolution of a monastery and feel like he was doing God's work. Far away in a palace or out in a procession. Were all the reports honest? Maybe not, but who was to know? For the people living nearby, what was it like for them? The greatest work of art and beauty they might ever see, the rich and gold ornaments, were taken down, the tapestries removed. The ones you'd stared at and contemplated for perhaps hundreds of hours, all gone. The exquisite wood carvings and furniture, all ripped out. Even the lead removed from the roof, all pulled down and sold, usually by Cromwell's contractors, men from far away. Local workmen often refused to take part in something so distasteful. A local landlord might get the land for a song, bringing better times, but usually it was a connected person at Henry's court who bought the land, just another distant landlord. Ho-hum. All that art and beauty gone. What was left to admire and inspire youth in the area? This is too much to bear. To arms! To arms! And the monks themselves, what of them? Well, generally they had to agree to the charges against themselves and voluntarily agree to dissolve. Under pressure from even greater threats, we suppose. And the monks got lifetime pensions. Yeah, I bet you didn't expect that.
No, I didn't see that coming. I did not realize it was done on such a civilized basis.
I'm not myself clear on what practical strings came with those pensions, such as how easy they were to collect if you moved across country or back to another country, because we know a lot of these monks were foreign. We do know lots of ex-monks living in towns near their former monasteries, receiving their pensions, able to live modestly among their neighbors for the rest of their lives. So the monasteries were dissolved, God's work was being done. The crown got richer, and more of the gentry and nobility got former church land. These people who somehow got former church land became, without ever being conscious of it, an important interest group in the disputes to come. They might have eventually amounted to a quarter or so of all landowners, read members of Parliament, having a piece through subsequent sales, and practically all of the really important landed families. Was this an intention of Cromwell's? Parliament essentially gave Henry power over the church, which implies that it had the power to do so, and then ended up being full of people who had a financial stake in this religious settlement. I mean, what if the Pope came back to England and wanted his lands back? That's what a lot of the traditionalists were saying should happen. Owning church lands was sinful. They said that too. Did Cromwell organize this to make Parliament itself a guarantor of the Protestant Reformation? He was a highly motivated Protestant. He was a wise, practical politician, and perhaps a genius with an extraordinary capacity for hard work. But was he that brilliant? Historians more and more have Cromwell's back. One of the main reasons is that the rich data of the Tudor period, of which there's a library of scholarship, remember, is often credited to him. He ordered parishes to keep a record of everyone who was born, died, married, and baptized within the parish with identifying information. Parish financial information, including charity and administration. In other words, a lot of our knowledge derives from Cromwell in a way, and historians know it. This was copied throughout Europe. One key, I think, was the record of baptisms. Someone who didn't let their children be baptized was under a cloud of suspicion of being an Anabaptist. So the crown did God's work and got rich from threads 1 and 2, but people rose up in rebellion, with the pilgrimage of grace in the north being the greatest challenge to Henry's authority. Third thread. Henry and Cromwell did not have the tools to deal with this on their own. Fourth thread. Henry had to rely on the landed aristocracy for military acumen, recruitment, and campaigns. Fifth thread. And the fifth thread meant that Henry could not go all the way in reforming religion, not in practice. Even if he gave the job to people like Cromwell and Cranmer to convince the people and deal with the practicalities of running a huge part of the economy and labor force, i.e. the church. The higher nobility were naturally invested in the system as it was. Of course they were. Of course they were. Cromwell cunningly got them financially invested in Protestantism, but ideologically they would have to get there more gradually. So when Henry died and young Edward died later, and they could put a good Catholic on the throne, they would do it, repenting at leisure. Her name was Mary, granddaughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. History knows her as Bloody Mary. But first, Cromwell must fall in one of the most sordid and pathetic series of marriages the world has ever known. Next week on Hanging with History, after conversations with Camie.
Okay, we'll figure it out.
Hey, Camie, you just had a chance to listen to episode 25. What'd you think?
You and Raul, well, sometimes the two of you slide things in on me anyways, and I just kind of give you the look and keep on going. But, yeah, remember, guys, this is supposed to be a family show. Behave yourselves. You don't know when the kids are going to be listening in.
True enough.
Well, I was really interested when you were discussing the actions against the immoral monasteries. One of my questions was, who was deciding which ones were immoral? I really appreciated it when you went back around and talked about all the surveys.
The investigations.
The visits and investigations, and it sounds like they were pretty thorough. Who went in to check out these monasteries?
There were different phases. So the first groups were Cromwell's men, motivated Protestants. They weren't there to really investigate. They were there to settle a score with the old way of doing religion. They were totally motivated to get the new religion going and the old superstitious one gone. Then later, there was another phase where, like, the local JPs were told to go and investigate their local monasteries. And
that must have been uncomfortable. The locals going in, and they would know each other. They would be doing business with the monasteries.
And those reports tended to be a lot more favorable than Cromwell's investigators. And then there were later phases where they were really trying to wrap things up, started to be much more obviously about the money. And then it was Cromwell's investigators again. And they even reinvestigated some that had passed muster before.
So over what kind of a time period? I mean, they'd walk in and start investigating almost like auditors or something. How long was it before they would say, oh, you've got to close? Or did that vary?
The investigations could be pretty short, a couple weeks.
Wow. It just amazes me, all the thoroughness that went through to justify, I suppose.
Yeah, Cromwell had this.
They had to justify it.
Yep, they had to justify it. Question really is whether they were being so thorough in order to justify it to the outside world, in order to justify it to others, or whether they, in some sense, had sort of tricked themselves into it.
That's a way of thinking of it. Sometimes we have to talk ourselves into things, doing things that may not be perhaps above board or the right thing to do.
Oh, yeah, all the time, I think.
So, who made the final call? Was it Cromwell or Henry?
The king. I think the point, from Cromwell's point of view, was to get the monasteries dissolved. But Henry had to approve each one.
The other thing I noticed was how, in your discussion today, was the comparison of how much more murdery Europe were compared to England at the time. The fact that Bloody Mary was not so bloody after all.
Well, she was, for the English context, and she did embarrass people, and she did really earn that name. It did really turn off an enormous part of society and made them ashamed of being Catholic. But, yeah, you're right, in the sense that Europe was just a completely different game. But everything was really quite different in Europe. That's the point I want to be hammering home. We're going to be seeing innovations of thought and behavior in England as we go forward. We're going to see political innovation. We're going to see economic innovation. We're going to see science. And it's going on in England to a far greater degree than anywhere else. It's certainly not the only place experiencing innovation, but it's happening there first. And it's happening so fast. My basic contention is it happened that way in England because England was already so different.
I mean, because the attitudes about life were different?
Ooh, I wish I could summarize it that well. I'm not confident enough to say exactly what it was. But there's that whole lot of things that I point to in many different episodes.
So we're going to learn how England was cutting edge as we move forward.
Oh, well, we already are, I think, by being minimally murdery.
And thanks, Raul. I appreciate you coming on the program.
But how can I explain? How can I explain it to you? You'll understand less after I've explained it. All that I can hope to make you understand is only events, not what has happened. And people to whom nothing has ever happened cannot understand the unimportance of events.
That's T.S. Eliot from The Family Reunion.